Our next speaker is an expert on understanding conflict and resolution. Please join me in welcoming Vice Chair, Global Affairs of the Carlyle Group and Chair of the Board of Trustees at the Rockefeller Foundation, Admiral James Stavridis, who will be in conversation with Vice President, Executive Editor, Times Network, Mihir Bhatt, about whether India can prevent a third world war.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome, James, to this very interesting session. But before I engage Admiral James in this conversation, let me give you a bit of a background. He has written a very interesting book about the Third World War. It's called 2034. And surprisingly, it has a very prominent role for India mentioned in the book. So we thought this is a good opportunity to get Admiral James here, straight from US, live and exclusive, and get his perspective about why he thinks that India will be in a position to influence the course of the Third World War. Admiral James, thank you so much for joining us, and it's a pleasure having you at India's largest economic event, India Economic Conclave. My first question to you, Admiral, you have in your book very extensively spoken about India and the role that India will play in the Third World War. But I want to start with the current situation, and that is the war that is currently raging in Ukraine, where we have heard this word, Third World War time and again. India has taken a stance which many people in West are finding slightly contradictory to what ideally a democracy should be doing. But what is your take on the stance that India has taken in the current Ukraine conflict?
Well, let's start with the situation in Ukraine. And by the way, thank you for having me. I had wished to be here in person. I appreciate the opportunity to address this important gathering in this format. Here in the situation as it stands now, we see a large, powerful military on the part of Russia now pushing into Ukraine. There are very serious allegations of human rights violations in addition to the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. The United Nations has overwhelmingly voted to condemn this action. A handful of nations have abstained from it. So that's kind of the current situation. In terms of India, certainly from the perspective of Washington, there is hope that India will take a more aggressive stance in condemning this kind of behavior. On the other hand, there is a realization that India has traditionally played a kind of middle role. Looking back, for example, to the Cold War, India worked with both sides, I thought, very well in that regard. I suspect that as we go forward in this conflict, there are potentially could be opportunities for India to be part of mediating this conflict. And let's face it, in any global conflict, in order to resolve it, you need states who can speak openly and directly to both sides of a conflict. So even as you mentioned, my book, 2034, A Novel of the Next World War, is actually about a world war between the U.S. and China, in which India plays a role in finally resolving that conflict. I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but India plays a very important role. Is it possible that India could do so in this situation? I think it is possible. We're obviously some time away from hitting that point. I think there's going to be more actual combat over the coming months. But as both sides become more and more exhausted and see that there is no exit available, I think a very interesting step would be for the world's largest democracy, India, to step in and speak both to Moscow and Washington and offer its good offices potentially for some level of mediation.
Right. So are you essentially saying that somewhere West, and especially US and UK, are not playing the role that ideally they should be playing in a conflict like this, and maybe just trying to keep it alive, and countries like India are taking an independent stance which which is not necessarily working well for the West?
I think for the West, they have to understand, and by the way, it's US, UK, it's really all of NATO, it's essentially the democracies of Europe, as well as Japan, South Korea, Australia. When you kind of add it all up in terms of gross domestic product, it's, well north of 60% of the world's GDP is aligned in condemning Russia. So that's an important factor to consider. On the other hand, there's a huge, if you will, swing vote out there in terms of vast parts of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, South Asia, India most specifically, and frankly, China. So this is really a three-handed situation with the Western democracies pretty certain in their mind of their positions. Russia, on the other hand, according to Vladimir Putin, quite certain of its position here. And then this swing vote that I just mentioned. Here's the point. The West has to work to convince the rest of the world about the efficacy of its position. Too often, the Western nations simply believe that their positions are self-evident. And that is not how that truth is received in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, South Asia, China. So it's incumbent upon the West to realize they can't simply, by fiat, say, here's the way forward. Instead, think of it not a war of ideas, it's a marketplace of ideas. And so the West has to compete in that marketplace, lay out its case, use truth as its primary approach. If the West does that, I think over time, the case can be made quite strongly that there are human rights violations and violations of sovereignty here. But those will be decisions that, in the case of India, will be made by Indians, not by the West, nor by Moscow, I would say.
Right. I'll turn towards the book now. James, one thing which I think sort of hit me very starkly after reading this book was the diminishing military and surveillance capability of United States of America and the rising military and surveillance capability of China, the cyber warfare capability of Russia, and the simple military capability of India, especially in the Indian Ocean region, and obviously, I mean, in the skies of Indian subcontinent. Now, how realistic is this assumption that you have portrayed in your book?
The book is set in the year 2034. That, again, is the name of the novel, 2034, a novel of the next World War. So people ask me often, Admiral, have you written a book of predictive fiction? Is this how you think the world will come out? The short answer is no. It's a work of cautionary fiction, and the caution is directed at the United States of America. In the book, by the year 2034, the United States has failed to keep up militarily with the rising capability of China. The United States has not tended the garden of its allies, partners, and friends. It's quite clear by 2034 in the novel that the United States has turned inward, has become an isolationist power. I think that would be an enormous mistake for the United States. And here, of course, we come to the role of India in the book. I think that if the United States does not maintain its pace with China, and if the United States fails to continue to work hard, compete in this marketplace I spoke of a moment ago, this marketplace of ideas, if the United States fails to do that, it will end up in a situation where it could very, very conceivably end up in a conflict with China. India, I think, perhaps by 2034, perhaps it's another decade or another decade after that. But as I look at the trajectory of this century, I'll put it this way. 300 years from now, when a historian looks back to write the history of the 21st century, it will be far less about the rise of China. It will be about the rise of India. And I believe that because of the demographics, because of the geography, India sits in a position to dominate the Indian Ocean, a vast, unexploited body of water. It has an enviable geographic position, and it also is a democracy. And I believe that is a strength for India, as I believe it's a strength for any nation. So as I look at China's hand of cards compared to that of India, my view is as the century unspools, India's rise is going to be perhaps the most important geopolitical muscle movement of the 21st century. And so in the novel, just as we were speaking a moment ago of India's ability to be in a position to speak, in the case of Ukraine, both to Moscow and to Washington, in the novel, India is in a position to participate militarily, diplomatically, and ultimately is part of resolving the world war that is hypothetically set in 2034. I'll close with one final thought, and it's on military technology. By 2034, and I think this, in fact, is very realistic, there will be much more of a premium on cyber capability, on space operations, on unmanned vehicles, on maritime operations, very broad area. These are all areas where I can see India gaining traction over the coming decade or two, and thus that is part of the backstory of the novel 2034.
Right. The other thing which is very prominent in your book, and currently that country is sort of under the lens, that is Russia. What comes out very clearly in that book is Russia ends up becoming a marginalized nuclear power, which is probably trying to, get some benefit out of the conflict between predominantly China and US, and it almost ends up playing second fiddle to China in many ways. If you can elaborate on that.
I think, unfortunately for Moscow, I think that is a pretty realistic prediction. As you look at demographics, an enormous strength for India, it's an enormous weakness for Moscow. Population is only 150 million and actually in decline. Additionally, Russia has failed to really diversify its economy. It has none of the vibrancy that you see in the Indian economy, the American economy, where there are the Chinese economy, where there are movements and entrepreneurs and a drive toward creating real technology and real wealth. You don't see that in Russia. You also see high rates of alcoholism, high rates of drug abuse, and certainly many nations, including my own, have challenges in that regard. But when you look at where Russia is in terms of its population in particular, it's not a democracy. That ultimately, I believe, is a weakness for states. And it has this vast land area, but it does not have the economy to go with it. And therefore, if you're in Beijing and you look north, what do you see? You see a vast, empty stretch of land. In fact, Russia's population almost entirely lives to the west of the Ural Mountains. That vast Siberian landscape, which is the size of the continental United States, is effectively empty. If you're Beijing, you look north and you see oil, gas, arable land, water. You see rare earths, gold, diamonds. It is a cornucopia. It is a vast treasure house. And the Chinese look at that like my dog looks at a ribeye steak. It looks really good. And so I think Russia is on the way to becoming a junior partner in a relationship with China in a way that will be very discouraging for Russia. And therefore, in the novel 2034, where, by the way, Vladimir Putin is still alive. He's a senior octogenarian in his 80s, but Russia is reduced to really playing the role of a spoiler. And that is the role they play in 2034. And I think that is realistic. I'll close with this thought. Vladimir Putin is a clever tactician. He can seize a moment. He can move inside his opponent's decision loop. He marshals intelligence very cleverly. He's a very smart tactician. He is a bad strategist. His overarching strategy, which you see on display in Ukraine, will not work, and it will only end up diminishing Russia, diminishing its economy, and therefore propelling it into this junior partnership with Beijing. That's not where Russia ought to be trying to head.
Right. Now there is other part or the other side to this current conflict, and I'm trying to link it to the Third World War scenario because Russia has already used that word too many times since February when the war started, and that is the global energy scenario and the way things are moving right now. There is that constant looming threat from Russia that they might shut down the Siberian pipeline, and that will create havoc in the global energy market. Considering all of that, what is your take on the global energy scenario right now? And can that in itself trigger the next wave of economic come geopolitical crisis?
Unfortunately, yes. And clearly the strongest card in the hand of cards that Vladimir Putin holds is energy. It is his oil and gas, his connection to various parts of the world, and even as that vital connection of the moment, oil and gas to Western Europe, is cracking under potentially even harsher sanctions. Even as that occurs, it's going to create demand in other parts of the world, exactly as you point out. So the phrase I use is, we are going to see these energy markets rewired. They're not going to simply explode. I don't see a massive cracking of the economy as a result of Russia simply coming offline, but it's going to take time and effort and resources to rewire these systems. An example would be the Europeans, who will be scrambling in the aftermath of natural gas and oil, will have to push harder on the United States. The United States, on the other hand, will want to push harder on the Middle Eastern states, notably Saudi Arabia, UAE, to increase their production. A wild card here might be Venezuela, which has enormous reserves. But simply talking about it in an interview like this is very different than building the infrastructure, moving the tankers, building new pipelines. I'll close with this point. China, of course, very strongly wants an opportunity to buy discounted oil and gas from Russia. But the pipelines aren't there. That's not where those pipelines run. They typically run in the other direction. So you're going to have to ship it there or build new pipelines. And then finally, the overhang of potential sanctions on China if they step in to float the Russians by buying their oil and gas. That's another geopolitical concern here. Bottom line, we all ought to be hoping that this war can be resolved in a negotiation, that some neutral parties will step in to create a venue where a negotiation can occur. Ideally, this would be the United Nations. The United Nations tend to be gridlocked because the Security Council has members who are party to the dispute, both of whom have a veto. That's why the international community must think creatively to find mediation in order to resolve this, because I think you're absolutely right. The crucial through line here, the difficulty will be in the energy sector, because you can't rewire it overnight. It will take time to do so.
Right. So are we looking at a much deflated outlook on the economic growth front for this year and maybe next year as well, global economic outlook?
I think, unfortunately, the growing consensus, and you see outlying views to this, but as all of us are looking at the geopolitics of this conflict, it appears to be stretching into the future. There appears to be no quit, if you will, in Vladimir Putin. He's going to continue to force troops. He's brought a new general in. He's going to have an easier set of logistics to deal with now that he's focused on the southeast of Ukraine, not trying to take over the entire country. So Putin, I think, will continue this for some time. I think President Zelensky has shown us that he has no quit in him, and the center of gravity of this conflict increasingly is the will and the resistance of the Ukrainians. And on the part of the West, you are continuing to see more weapons systems, heavier weapons systems put in the hands of the Ukrainians. So when I put all that together, I look at a conflict that stretches into the future. We talked about impact on energy, oil and gas. The other obvious, enormous impact is on food and food security. Ukraine and Russia combined produce 40% of the world's wheat in a normal year. Right. Also enormous levels of fertilizer. If those are removed from the markets, in the case of sanctions on the part of Russia, and in the case that the Ukrainian economy has cratered and is cracked and is going to have at least a 50% collapse in GDP, making all of that difficult to move. I think that, yes, we ought to worry about energy. That is going to take time to rewire. The tactical challenge is going to be food and fertilizer, and that could have very significant impact, notably in North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which rely on that wheat flowing across the Mediterranean Sea. So that's a long way of saying, unfortunately, the turbulence predictably is going to continue. If we do not get to mediation in the 2, 4, 6 month period, right, I think we are looking at significant recessionary pressures. And then finally, unfortunately, as supplies diminish, what happens? Demand chases supply, prices rise. So we've got inflation to contend with. Central banks will therefore be feeling the pressure of inflation and thus will be themselves raising interest rates. It is a bad set of challenges coming together. I don't want to use the words a perfect storm, but it certainly is a squall, a turbulence coming together toward the end of this year. I think we will see pretty significant slowdowns at the end of this year and well into next year, unfortunately.
All right. I want to come back to the book. One thing which you have very interestingly mentioned is Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi continues to be in the power, but I mean the cue that I got from the book is that he becomes the president of India. And the second very interesting thing that you mentioned is the Kashmir issue is resolved, and Pakistan is sort of just existing there. I mean, that's what you mentioned in the book. So I mean, what was your thought process when you thought of this scenario? Because this is something which internally many people have debated. Nobody has written it, and you have actually sort of elaborated it in your book.
Well, let's begin by reminding the audience that this is a novel. It's fiction. And as a novelist, when you put a plot together and you want to set up a certain outcome, occasionally you have to have some pieces of the narrative that have changed. Again, this is not predictive fiction at all, but my central thesis, where we began our conversation, is really about the importance of India in the 21st century. And so to put that piece in play, it was necessary to have a stable India, an India that is not constantly worried about, appropriately at the moment, about conflict with Pakistan. So the novel kind of puts that aside in order to put India in the position that I think it will ascend to over the course of the century. Whether Mr. Modi is part of that or not are decisions for Indians to make, not for American admirals or American novelists. So I'll leave that to the Indian audience. I will say this, in the novel, in the United States, where I think I am qualified to speak about, the President of the United States is not only a woman, which is not particularly surprising. Of course, your own nation has been led by a woman, pioneering in that regard, by the way. But what is interesting, in my view, is that she is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. In the novel, by 2034, the political parties in the United States have really lost their grip on power. And the United States is moving toward more of a parliamentary type situation with multiple political parties. So the point of all this is to say, internal politics will change. They are much harder to predict than geopolitics, I think. In the case of the United States, there are some changes. In the case of India's political future, I'll leave that in the capable hands of Indians to discuss.
Right. I'll take one last question from you, James. You did mention that 300 years from now, when the history is written, it will be about rise of India and not rise of China. If you can just sum up this session by giving us few details of why you think so and why it makes sense.
Yeah, let's start with China's situation. And I think we talked a moment ago about demographics. China has very, very challenging demographics. An aging population because of the one-child policy for many years. They're having difficulty kind of restarting production, if you will, in terms of their population. That decline ought to concern them. They also have a very frothy real estate market. They have challenges in terms of producing agricultural products. They have no oil and gas. They have limited access to the sea compared to, for example, India. So China does not have as strong a hand of cards over the long term as many people believe. On the other hand, India has very strong demographics. It has a democratic tradition, is a democracy. And above all, it enjoys significant geographic advantage. It has a vibrant culture. As I look at the two nations, I think that the story of this century will be the rise of India. And in that case, the portion of the book that talks about India's role balancing between Beijing and Washington, I think is not unrealistic at all. Nor, in my view, is it unrealistic in our current circumstance as well. So bottom line, democracy. Don't bet against it. We're in a time when there's a lot of speaking about authoritarian nations like China and Russia. I would not bet against democracy. And I will say this, that as an American who comes from a nation, relatively small compared to India in terms of population, but as a democracy, I salute India as the world's largest democracy. And I think that is the heart of the strength of your nation.
Well, Admiral James, thank you so much for joining us. I hope everything that you mentioned in your book, 2034, the next World War, doesn't come true. But at least the positive part of the role that India will play on global stage comes true, definitely. Thank you so much, Admiral James. It was a pleasure having you at the India Economic Conclave.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for an excellent interview. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you, Admiral James.